Hey gang, and welcome to the latest episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoy these terrifying tales. And remember, if you have a story that you would like to hear in a future episode, please send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. And thanks for those of you who have sent in your scary Home Alone stories. Keep them coming for the next volume. That'll be next week. And now, without further ado, let's begin. The Invisible Creature. Back about 1957, a couple who were friends of mine and my first husband's were living in an old one-story house outside of Vancouver, Washington. They had 2 little boys and a dog. The wife was undergoing some heavy problems with a delayed sexual awakening, and, at least in my opinion, the husband was being a jerk about it, hypnotizing her to have sex and stuff like that. Charming, if what she was telling me was true. When they had been in the house for a few months, they both began reporting odd goings-on. They had both heard something very large and heavy enough to shake the ground with its footsteps come up from a nearby ravine and walk around their house, trying to get in. It would snuffle and growl and make other animal noises. And this happened several times, always at night. It did not seem to matter whether they were both at home or either parent was home alone with or without the boys. The dog had pups, and when they were old enough, the husband rounded them up to take them to the pound for adoption. He had missed one and ran over it, pulling out of the driveway. I knew nothing of this. 2 nights later, I was babysitting with my own kids and theirs when I felt a puppy's little claws climbing the arm of the couch I was on. I put out a hand to help the pup along, but there was nothing there. The older of the 2 boys, then about 3 or 4, was heard talking with someone in the room at his nap time. The parents distinctly heard both Todd and a second male voice. Both parents dashed into the room to find the child reaching towards the window calling, "Don't go! Don't go!" This was almost written off as the standard invisible playmate, except for 2 factors. A breeze was blowing into the window, but the curtains had blown out the same window, and that window had been closed to keep the child warm during his nap on a cool day. He was not strong enough to open it alone. The whatever it was continued to prowl outside, and the family became terribly afraid of what might happen if it got inside. They stopped ever going outside after sundown for any reason whatsoever. And after a winter of fearing for their lives, unable to afford to move, they talked it over with us one night, and we decided to try to eliminate it. Since the husbands fed the families by hunting deer and elk, they both had powerful rifles, and we had some walkie-talkies. The men rigged searchlights all around the house, strung to a single switch inside the house. And late in the afternoon, the husbands got into an old car they sat on in the property in plain sight of the house and hunkered down out of sight. They stayed there with coffee and sandwiches and one of the walkie-talkies. Shortly after sundown and dark, we women inside the house began to hear the thing walking the perimeter of the building and felt the ground shake with its steps. We heard it hitting the walls, the doors, and the windows. I threw the switch for the lights, and the men came out of the car with rifles at the ready. They saw the tall grass moving as though something large walked through it, but could not see what made the grass move. I was in contact with my husband via walkie-talkie, and while we were inside, we were hearing the sounds the thing made. The men heard nothing at all, just the breeze in the trees and grass, and the crackle of my voice on the radio. We were all very scared, but there were no more disturbances at the house, and our friends moved out without incident a few months later. I can still feel the knot where my gut should be, and hear those noises. We never found out what it was all about, and the house was demolished sometime later. I've often wondered ever since whether the family's emotional or sexual problems gave rise to the poltergeist activity, but she was no adolescent, she was at least 22. The kids were toddlers, and we still have no explanation. I Grew Up with a Killer, submitted by Jesse G. I knew this kid named Josh. He was the cliché arrogant football jock that every rich kid liked and all the girls adored. Now, I know my opinion of him sounds derived from jealousy, but truth be told, I have no tolerance for arrogant pricks, which this guy was the pure definition of. Anyway, I got kicked out of Ventura High School for fighting and pulling class clown pranks. I didn't see Josh till years later, when I found out he also got kicked out of Ventura High School, but for drugs. He had become a meth head. 3 or 4 years later, we ended up sharing a math class together in an adult education course for our GEDs, which I like to call good enough diplomas. We didn't have assigned seats, so each day our classmates sat wherever they wanted to, according to who arrived to class first. On this particular day, he sat next to me. I was sitting there zoning out. I was listening to a Motorhead Danzig mixed playlist on my iPod, when suddenly I snapped out of my stupor by this ass monkey pulling out my earbud and demanding that I stop copying the answers on his paper. A, it wasn't true, because like I said, I was zoned out and not even writing anything on my paper. And B, I was chapters behind him in our textbook because I hated math, and I pretended to work to fool the teacher when she would pass by my desk. She was at her desk at the time, so she didn't see me responding to him by calling him a homophobic slur and threatening to slap him. He got up, grabbed his textbooks, and told me to F myself. I responded by telling him to tuck his tail and called him a female dog. From then till class was over, man, I was hot. All I could think about was kicking his ass. When class was eventually over, I walked out the doorway and looked back to see him talking to the teacher, so I figured, if he snitches on me today, I'll kick his ass tomorrow, but if he doesn't say anything, I'll let it go. Turns out he didn't say anything, so I let it go. He didn't sit next to me, and we never talked about it after that. I got my GED weeks later and left the course. And a year or two later, and this is around 2009 or 2010, I was heading over to this skinhead dude's pad whose name is Bones. He sold weed, and I wanted to buy some. He had this fat girlfriend who I saw at his pad from time to time, and that night as I neared his apartment, I heard this loud wailing, like someone was crying and trying their loudest to let everyone know. Hesitantly, I knocked on the door and was greeted by Bones' serious demeanor. He invited me into the front room, and his girlfriend was sitting on the couch, sobbing profusely. I asked what was wrong. Her eyes were glued to a TV screen that I wasn't paying attention to, but she began to tell me that her brother got arrested for a murder that he didn't commit, and now she's worried about acquiring the money to hire a lawyer for him. I looked at the TV screen, and on KEYT Channel 3 News, I noticed a face I hadn't seen in a while. It was that kid Josh from that math class in high school. Apparently, while high on meth, he broke into a family's house in a beach community in Ventura called Faria Beach. A family consisting of a father, pregnant mother, an 11-year-old daughter, and a 9-year-old son lived there. He broke in an attempt to rob the place, wearing a motorcycle helmet to conceal his identity, and he encountered the mother in the kitchen where he violently beat her and forced her to perform oral sex on him. The father came in from another part of the house and caught on to what was going on and tried to fight Josh. From there, I don't know if Josh brought his own knife or found one in the kitchen or whatever, but this was taking place and he stabbed the father, fatally wounding him, then turned the blade on the mother, killing her and her unborn child. While all this happened, the 9-year-old son offered Josh his mother's purse and his father's wallet, begging for him to stop killing his parents. But after stabbing the parents, Josh fled the scene. It was a miracle he didn't kill the children. He did this months after our little argument at school, and how they caught him was through a DNA sample he submitted after being incarcerated for an unrelated petty crime. They say a serial killer is a killer who kills 3 or more people, and that's what he became in that fatal night. You could blame it on the meth or whatever, but in the short time I knew and was interfaced with him, I saw a hateful and greedy person, a landmine waiting to be stepped on. I kind of wish I had kicked his ass that day way back when, but then I think to myself, would he have stabbed me to death? Or killed me in a worse possible way? It trips me out. Don't believe me? Just Google search Josh Packer Faria Beach Killer. You'll see what I mean, and to think that I knew this dickhead. He got life in prison without parole, and that serves his punk ass right. The Polling Place by Sharon. The house I grew up in was a very old brick house with a full attic, and a basement that no one in their right mind would ever want to go in. It used to be headquarters for the McNeil Rangers, and there were manacles on the wall in the basement. I guess prisoners had been shackled there. There was a slave quarters around back also. The house was huge and had a winding staircase with a landing at the upstairs, and then the staircase went on and around up to the attic. In this house, you could hear all kinds of activity inside and outside the house. When we first moved in and were checking things out, we found a door in the attic that was nailed and boarded shut. We should have left well enough alone. My father and uncle took the boards off the door, and that was when things began happening. We could hear furniture moving around up in the attic, and someone walking at all times of the day or night. It was mostly confined to that room that had been boarded up, but not always. That room was always cold, even in the middle of summer, and if you shut the door, you could go back up the next day and it would be wide open. If you opened it and propped it open, it would be closed and stuck when you went back, and would be harder to open. We named our ghost Georgie, and don't ask why, it's just how we referred to it when we talked about it. He didn't really scare us, although it made everyone uneasy to hear the moving of furniture and the footsteps. One morning I was in bed and I heard someone walk past the bedroom on the way downstairs. I didn't pay any attention as my uncle was spending a couple of weeks with us. It was about a half hour later when I heard someone walking down the stairs past my bedroom, and my uncle stuck his head in the door and said, "Morning, sleepyhead." I asked, "Did you go downstairs just a little while ago?" He said no, he had just gotten up himself. Other times we could hear a piano playing a really old melody. We didn't have a piano. The music always seemed to come from the parlor, which would have been a perfect place for a piano if we had had one. Another time we were really nervous was when we heard what sounded like several different animals all making sounds together and walking around the house. We could even hear the crust of the snow breaking through the footfalls of what sounded like a man but making noises of animals. We heard someone or something come up on the porch as far as the door, and my mother demanded it leave. All was quiet then. When we went out the next morning to see the footprints in the snow, there weren't any. The crust of the snow hadn't been broken at all. I've since learned that the sound of several animals like that could be a demon of some kind. I know, that just sounds awful. Also at this house, you could always hear cars pull up and hear people talking, and car doors close, and then hear the people come into the house talking, but no one would be there. More than one time, we thought my sister and her boyfriend were back from being out. We would go to see what they had brought back, and no one would be there. I was used to the things inside the house, but I tell you, I always hated that basement. It had a bad vibe to it. You could just walk by the door and feel the negative feelings. Once after they had torn the house down, I took my daughter, who was about 9 years old at the time, to where it used to stand, and the only thing remaining was the back porch and the door that went down to the cellar. My daughter stood there looking down, trying to see something, and called out, "Georgie, come out, I want to see you." That terrified me. I told her to never call something by its name or invite it anywhere. At that house, it's hard to tell what you may be inviting. All of this is true. The reason I called this story The Polling Place is because it is the name of the people we got it from. I don't know if they had any experiences there or not. If they did, they didn't talk about it, but I'm sure they did. Maybe they weren't as receptive to it as my family, or maybe they ignored it and passed it off as something else. But now the house is torn down, I have no idea where they are or if even they're still alive, and I guess I'll never know. Stay Away from the Light. Submitted by Racer X. I am a male, 5'10", in my late 40s, and living somewhere in the state of Missouri. I'm sorry to say I have not experienced any sightings of ghosts, goat men, Bigfoot, aliens, werewolves, etc., although I have friends and family who have, but it's another story for another time. I did experience a night that I thought would be my last. This event took place back in 1987 or 88, when I was 17 or 18. I was at a friend's condo, partying with a few more friends and other acquaintances. And this was the place to hang out, since my friend's mother was divorced and worked the night shift, so we could rock the house as well as other things that parents and police would not approve of, without any interruptions. Well, around 1 a.m. the beer supply became low, so 5 of us, one of them being my best friend, who we will call Jeremy, decided to make a beer, snacks, and cigarette run. So we took 2 cars, since one was a 2-seater, which was driven by our legal-age 21-year-old beer supplier, and my car, which had the trunk space, plus a back seat for the other party supplies. After the supplies were purchased, the 5 of us were standing in the parking lot taking a smoke break and bullshitting for a minute, and our 21-year-old beer supplier, who we will call Mitch, spoke up and told us about a cave that he and his other friends partied in a few times before. That was about 10 miles or so from his place, and was about 15 feet up in an abandoned quarry that was now filled with water. The cave went back pretty far, and there were only 2 ways to get to it. Then I chimed in and said I had driven by that general area, remember seeing a 10-foot chain-link fence with 3 strands of barbed wire to deal with at the top. And then there was the road itself, if you wanted to call it that, since nature had almost taken it all back, and you could barely ride a dirt bike through it. Not to mention, there was nowhere to park the cars without drawing attention, especially from Johnny Law. I then said, of course there are bolt cutters, but was sorry to say I must have left mine at home. Mitch started laughing and said he had already thought of all that, and then started to describe the second way in. As we all listened to Mitch begin to tell us that to avoid all the issues I stated before, we would follow him to where some railroad tracks crossed this 2-lane back road. We would park the cars on the left side next to the tracks, since there was a small gravel area by them, and the forest line that the trailroad crew would park their cars or leave supply trailers, which was not really visible from the road. Next, we would cross the street to the right side and follow the tracks towards the quarry area, leave the tracks to the left, go down a small embankment, and then crawl through a hole in the fence that had been cut a long time ago, and follow a ledge to the mouth of the cave, and then we'd be at the party cave. Of course, my mind is trying to view this plan and how it sounded too easy. And then I asked Mitch about this ledge and how wide or not it was, since I also left my climbing gear at home. He assured me that we would be fine and no climbing gear would be needed. After his story was complete, and of course with alcohol in everyone's system, and for others who had decided to mix other chemicals with their beer to magnify their adrenaline, we all jumped into our cars and drove off to the tracks. Once we parked our vehicles in the gravel area, we crossed the street and started walking the tracks. I noticed that we had a problem right away. I asked how far this trek to the cave was, since that subject was not mentioned in his description before, and I was only familiar with the first way in. Mitch whispered, about 3 miles. Well, I had an idea how far 3 miles was, but that problem I noticed earlier was that to walk 3 miles meant we would have to cross a river on a train bridge. That was at least a half a mile up or down without any framing structure below. Let me give you a quick description of this bridge. There were 3 tracks that ran about 1.5 miles across the river, and railroad ties that the iron rails sat on had a space wide enough for a thin person to slip through to the river below. Then this track took a bend to the right, and somewhere which could not be seen at night, let alone during the day, since there was forest that hid the bend. And this river, which was deep and swift, would not matter to anyone who jumped, because if you did not die upon the water impact, you sure as hell wish you had. Plus, you could not see it. Yeah, it was that far down, although you could hear it, but who really cares at this point? Yes, I knew about the river, but the first way in was on the road and with a car. And this backup entry to this party cave was only easy access for Indiana Jones, so I once again whispered to Mitch that if he by any chance knew the train schedule for this route, he once again laughed. Not as much this time. He said not to worry, since there were 3 tracks, and they were never all used at once. Fucking wonderful, I feel so much better now. We all then began the long walk. Once we reached the train bridge, my friend Jeremy took the middle track, Mitch and the others took the far left track, and I took the far right track. As we started to cross this bridge in the dark, and of course without flashlights, another item I had conveniently left at home in my garage, we were really prepared. I could hear the river below, but of course saw nothing but black. Now, don't get me wrong, I could see Jeremy to my left somewhat, but I could not walk, look to my left, and talk since we all had to keep our attention to the major gaps between the railroad ties, which made the walking time longer and slower, not to mention watching for what we were hoping would not be coming our way in any direction. We walked gingerly and talked, trying to make the journey seem quicker and to let everyone know where we were at all times, but now at this time we were only halfway across the bridge. Understand, this time nobody had cell phones, since the cell phones then were the size of backpacks and out of anybody's price range. So I spoke up and mentioned to Mitch that the others would be bent if we did not get back with the supplies, since some of them had pitched in funds. Of course, Mitch said we would not stay long, but we could all review the cave, and if all approved, then the next party gathering would be held there. We all agreed and moved on, or tried to. I was the first one to stop cold, and Jeremy noticed immediately and asked what was wrong. I just stared forward without looking at Jeremy and said, "What the hell is that?" Jeremy said, "What's what?" "The fucking light that seems to be coming from around that bend that was not there earlier." Jeremy whipped his head forward and yelled for Mitch and the crew to stop. Upon taking Jeremy's order, I said in a low tone of voice, "Oh, shit." Mitch asked what was up. I told them to all look ahead at the bend and into the light. They all did so. The one guy who rode with Mitch, whose name I can't remember nor care to, but for this story we'll call him Jack, said something stupid like maybe it was a section of track that had a junction box with security lights. I told him he was full of shit, since I was very well aware that the light was not there before, and I was not moving another step until I could assure myself that it was no big deal, which so far was not working because my legs started to shake a little. Mitch spoke up and said it could not be a train since we couldn't hear anything, nor feel the rails vibrating. So he started walking forward until the sound of the train horn came from the same area as the light. "Not a train, oh wise man," I said, and the other two guys started to turn around and make sure it was not coming from behind us. Everyone started talking, and I told them to shut the fuck up and let me listen. And then I saw what I feared. The bright single light which basically made me feel like a deer in headlights on the front of a freight train heading right at us. Then the horn blared. I yelled at Mitch, "Well, Professor, which track is it on?" Because even with the big bright light on the front lighting its way, that didn't do dick for us. Mitch yelled, "Fuck it, backtrack now!" And we all turned to run, or tried to run, which a bystander would look like a very messed up hopscotch race. I could barely see the other two guys who had already turned and ran somewhat and had a good lead from us in the train. Mitch was pulling ahead some since he was 6'1" and could take longer steps, which I thought for sure he was going to miss one and go down, but at this time I didn't care and would explain it later to the cops if I had to, if there was a later. Now Jeremy was about the same size as me, so he and I kept up even until I noticed the light getting brighter, followed by hearing the horn again. Then Jeremy disappeared instantly. I stopped and yelled Jeremy's name but got no response, then yelled ahead to Mitch and the rest that I lost Jeremy, but they didn't even look back. I then turned to the light and saw my life flash before my eyes, not to mention a fucked up thought came into my head. I was now in the movie Stand By Me. I turned back to where Jeremy was supposed to be and screamed his name again, and started feeling around since looking down didn't help one bit. Then I heard Jeremy weakly say, "I'm down here." "Down where? I can't see you," I yelled. And then he talked again, and I, by luck, happened to feel his shoulder with my foot. Holy shit, hang on, man. I knelt down to see somewhat and felt that Jeremy had fallen through a big space between the rail ties and caught himself with his elbows. I took his one hand and started to pull him up and out of the gap when the horn sounded and the lights became brighter. Fuck, I thought, we're dead. Better get this guy and jump. For once I had Jeremy back on his feet. Once I had Jeremy back on his feet, we could barely hear the others yelling for where we had started this crazy adventure. They were screaming, "Run! Run!" I grabbed Jeremy's arm and yelled, "Let's move!" We did, which seemed like we were pros at train bridge running since we didn't miss a beat. I looked up and could now see the group standing by a dim streetlight right off the tracks, about 25 feet from where the tracks became above the river. They screamed, "You can make it! You can make it! You're almost there!" Jeremy and I could now feel the track vibrate a little, but we never looked back. And when we reached the edge where the track bridge met land, which was all gravel, we dove forward and tumbled down the small embankment. After we came to rest lying on our backs, seeing the rest of the crew to our left, they were walking up to us as the train flew by, horn blowing. I sat up and looked at this freight train that almost made me a memory, and then realized which track it was on. I jabbed Jeremy's side and pointed. Panting hard, Jeremy asked, "What?" In a tone of voice like I had just run a 5K, I pointed at the train and told him to look at the track. He stared for a minute and fell back, looking up at the night sky and in a low tone said, "Fuck me running." Mitch then asked what, as well, and I proceeded to inform him and the rest that the train was rolling on the track Jeremy had fallen through. They all just stared at the train in silence until the last train car flew by, and then maybe a minute more. Mitch broke the silence by saying, "Well, that was interesting. Maybe we should get back to the party and visit this cave another time." We all basically responded with, "Fuck that." Jeremy and myself got up and started walking back to our cars, saying absolutely nothing. Well, actually Jeremy said in a low voice, "Thanks for saving me back there." I told him any time, then yelled at the others, "Hey, thanks for the help, dickheads," then proceeded to ask him what happened. And all he said was he was running, trying to keep in rhythm with the rail ties, and then just went down, hitting an elbow, which actually stopped him from falling to his death. After we returned to the party, the rest of the goers just stared at Jeremy and myself since we had cuts and bruises, and I looked like I had just walked out of a coal mine. Some people started to ask what the fuck, but Mitch told everyone to chill a minute and gave us some towels and band-aids. Told us to clean up first and then drink heavily. I can tell you listeners that Jeremy and I are still best friends to this day, and sometimes when we get together we talk about the old days, or of course the crazy shit we did, and the train story always comes up. Also, the two of us did go back to the Bridge of Death a year later after the Run for Our Lives for a small party we had heard about, but this time we stayed on the gravel area land 50 yards from the bridge, and when some dumbass mentioned about crossing the bridge, Jeremy and myself, with cold beers in hand, told him our story. We don't think that guy or anyone else crossed, but we didn't stick around to find out. A House in Burbank by Dave. A few years ago, I moved into a house in Burbank with two other guys. It was a 3-bedroom house with some odd additions to it. For example, there was a wall between one bedroom and the main living room that could lift up and make it into one large room. On the kitchen walls, some of them were boarded up with holes that looked like places one could serve up plates of hot food to waiting customers. We didn't think anything about it because they were no longer usable, but they still were kind of interesting. The house was situated near some railroad tracks, but not so close as to think they would affect the inhabitants. After a few weeks, I noticed that long trains would go by late at night, around 3 or so in the morning, when it felt like they took hours to pass. I would lay in bed imagining these miles-long trains passing slowly by, vibrating my bed and windows for many, many minutes. I know I was awake and watching my clock, slightly pissed that this was the new house I moved into, and would just have to get used to it. Too bad that wasn't the worst of it. Around this time, I started drinking heavily for no real reason. I wasn't a depressed person, and I had many good friends, but I began to drink so much that I would end each night by flopping into my bed in a stupor and passing out, only to wake up with the sunlight streaming in on me. One night, however, I had to be awake early the next morning and have a clear head, so I went to bed without a drop in me. I laid down in bed in the dark and breathed slowly, waiting to fall asleep. But soon, I started to hear mirthful laughter and loud footsteps running up and down the hallway outside my bedroom. One of my roommates had stayed up to watch a movie with his girlfriend, and I couldn't understand why they were being so loud, knowing that I had to get up early. I thought, why are they acting like 5-year-olds, playing tag and hitting the walls? After about an hour of their racket, I fell asleep. The next evening, I asked my roommate, "So what were you and Jana doing last night? Were you playing tag?" My roommate looked at me quizzically. "What are you talking about?" "Last night, running up and down the hall, laughing like crazy. I know it was you. I heard both of you acting like drunken retards." "Dude, we watched Life is Beautiful. We were pretty darn quiet all night long." I was flabbergasted. I knew what they said was true and his denial was real. After that, I began noticing strange occurrences. Things pulling on my sheets at night from the bottom of the bed. The lights in the closet turning on and off, and the wooden floors would creak with the sounds of steps, even though I knew I was the only one in the room, cowering in bed. Glasses would break and send shards everywhere, and I continued drinking heavier and heavier until I was a steady alcoholic. Finally, one night my roommates and I went to the movies to see Black Hawk Down, if that helps with the time placement. When we got home, I went to hang up my jacket and found hanging in my closet a strange doll's head. Its face was made out of a sock, the features drawn on with a marker. It had 2 pigtails made of yellow yarn and 2 strange legs made of newspaper chains hanging down like tendons from its neck. When I opened my closet, I stared at it in horror, and then stopped. Went to my roommate's room and said, "You bastard, I know what you did." He looked at me and shook his head. "What?" "Dude, I know." "Dude, what are you talking about?" "If you don't know, then come here and look, but I know you know." I was being cryptic. My other roommate came into my room and saw what was hanging there, and his face turned white. All he said was, "Holy shit," and that he was glad he wasn't sleeping in my room. Soon after that, another one of our roommates left in fear of getting deported, and we replaced him with a friend that owned a black cat. The cat slept in my closet every night for the first 2 weeks. When we couldn't find the cat, he would be in the closet curled up on my coats. Then, just as suddenly, he wouldn't come into my room anymore at all. And about that time, all occurrences in my room stopped, and I stopped drinking heavily. Just like that. I didn't have any problems with addiction, and I went back to the level I was at before I moved in. Before I moved out of the house a year later, I spoke with the owner of the house, who, incidentally, was Tim Burton's uncle. He told me that the house used to be right near the train tracks about 60 years before, but they moved the entire thing to its current place, the same way you'd move a pancake from a pan to a plate. A neighbor in the know said that he knew 3 people had died in the house, 2 of them violently. Nothing ever happened after the cat moved in, and I owe a lot of calm, sleep-filled nights to that cat, and I won't soon forget him or that house. My UFO sighting on I-64, submitted by Brad L. I am a 36-year-old male with a straight-laced past and present, so the experience I had was in no way conjured from the side effects of any legal or illegal substances. It was late winter of 2000, between the early morning hours of 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., when I experienced something I never could comfortably explain, and I'll never forget. I am a bit of an impulsive individual, and boredom beckons my urge to travel no matter the destination, and in this case my destination was my family's farm, about an hour and a half southeast of St. Louis, in Perry County, Illinois. I have always been a bit of a night owl, so when I could not stand the confines of the city, I decided I needed to get out to the country and do some late-night trail riding on my new ATV. So I packed a bag, jumped in my truck, and started on a drive I had taken 1,000 times before. But this time, it would be like no other drive I had ever taken. I left St. Louis just before 1 a.m., headed south on I-64. Aside from the same few cars playing leapfrog for the past 35 miles and the bright high beams of oncoming vehicles, the drive was going smoothly. I was getting to the point of my drive where I could finally see something that had always captured my eye on this boring drive. There is a small town on the east side of I-64 that has a beautiful church that dominates the horizon due to the lights that illuminate its steeple. As I approached an overpass that marks the point where I can look off to my left and see the church, I noticed something far more spectacular dominating the night sky. I became entranced with a light that burned brighter than any artificial light I have ever seen, but strangely, it didn't seem to illuminate anything, at least not in the way I was used to seeing. This light had no true shape to it, so I have a hard time explaining exactly what it was I saw. It was just a very bright light that didn't seem to move. This light was about 800 yards east of the highway and about 500 feet in the air, so it was pretty close considering the intensity and mass of it. As I observed the light, I noticed that it felt like time itself slowed down, but little did I know it was just because I was coming to a crawl. I looked at my speedometer and I was going about 30 miles an hour, and I thought to myself, people should have blown by me now as I looked around, but it seemed like everyone was doing the same speed as me. As I focused on the traffic around me, that's when I noticed something truly strange starting to happen. The interior of everyone's vehicles were becoming illuminated. It looked like that scene from Christine when the car is trying to kill his girlfriend, or the scene from Close Encounters of the Third Kind when Richard Dreyfuss encounters the UFO for the first time in his truck. That's the best way I can describe it. The people in their vehicles seemed to be completely oblivious to the object in the sky, and whatever it was they were experiencing in that dead light, and I call it a dead light because I soon realized my cab is becoming illuminated, and it didn't seem to be bright, but everything was so illuminated and it couldn't seem to penetrate the glass to illuminate anything beyond the cab. At this point, a bit of panic set in, but I couldn't seem to speed up time, much less my truck, so all I could do was watch this light in the sky and the comatose people around me for the next 2 miles. After I traveled those long 2 miles, I finally hit a second overpass that marks the end of any visibility of the small town, the beautiful church, or the strange light that consumed me and a handful of others for how long I couldn't say. I do know that as soon as I was beyond the hill with the second overpass, it was like someone hit play. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and I made no stops for food, gas, or to clean the crap from my britches. I arrived at the farm at 3:30 in the morning. Bathroom Ghost, submitted by Lily. Hi, I'm Lily, and this is my true scary story. I was in school one day when I heard one of the girls in my class, let's call her Tracy for the sake of her identity, and she was talking to some other girls in the back of the classroom at recess. You're probably wondering, why are you inside at recess? Well, it was snowing outside, and whenever it snows, we don't go outside. Anyways, I overheard Tracy saying to the other girls that her sister, who was in 8th grade at the time, with one of her friends, they bought a Ouija board together. When they used it, Tracy's sister told Tracy that there was a spirit in the school that wanted to kill them. Fast forward, and I'm in 6th grade now. Tracy's sister is now in high school. I left my classroom to go to the bathroom, which was across from our classroom. So I walk in and use the bathroom, and as I am doing so, I hear a toilet a stall away from me flush. I thought nothing of it because I just thought it was another girl using the bathroom. But then I didn't hear footsteps or the sound of the bathroom stalls unlocking. It flushed a second time as I walked out of my stall. As I was washing my hands, the first sink next to the hand dryers, the last sink turned on as well. I got scared, so after I washed my hands, I dried them with toilet paper, and as I went to throw it out, the lights turned off, and keep in mind, I'm the only girl in this bathroom. I ran out of there as quick as I could all the way back to my classroom. I don't care if I disturbed a class or two by running out, but I don't care. I got there out of breath, and everyone gave me a weird look like I just got out of gym class or something. The teacher asked why I was out of breath, and I just said stupidly, I saw a spider. The teacher asked me to sit down, and I did. And after that, it was normal. The toilets flushed here and there, and the sink did turn on every once in a while, but it doesn't bother me as much as I did the first time. To this day, I do look back and laugh about the bathroom, though. The Woman Downstairs, submitted by 3 Left Turns. First off, I'm a male and was 22 and single when I moved into a new apartment in a multiple-unit building on the edge of the town I lived in at the time. There were 3 units, 2 on the bottom and my 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor. The guy in back was a truck driver and was rarely home, but the woman who lived in the front was in her early 20s and was a cocktail waitress at this bar not too far away from the place. Secondly, this is not creepypasta. This really happened in the winter of 2003. I don't care what anyone says, it's all true. Whether or not I think it was paranormal, I won't say because I don't really believe in that stuff. I was working as an accountant at the time, a field I'm no longer in. It was decent money, but I hated that line of work. I grew up in a very strict, very Catholic, very boring life, and couldn't even date until I was 18 to give you an idea of where I was coming from. I'm no longer religious or the straight-laced dork that I was, but like I said, I also don't believe in the paranormal. What happened to me that winter, I still can't explain. When I first moved in, she was already living there, and I'll refer to her as Karen. She was about 24, not bad looking, but just a little odd. I barely spoke with her for the first 3 or 4 weeks, but I would catch her looking out her front windows once in a while. I lived in Michigan at the time, and it wasn't until the first snow flew that I bumped into her and have a conversation. She seemed nice, but shy and quiet. We chatted about the snow for a minute, and I told her that I was thinking about buying a snow thrower for the driveway, but she said she had a plow service. And she said she was a great cook. I said I was a lousy cook, and we laughed and said goodbye. Another week went by, and I saw her coming out of her house to go to work at the bar a few blocks away. I said hi, and she asked what I was doing the next night being a Saturday. I had nothing going on, still hadn't found the next girlfriend at the time. She invited me over for dinner. I said sure, and she headed off to work. The next day I went downstairs to her place and knocked on the door. She opened it, and I could smell soup and fresh bread waft out of the door, and she invited me in. It took me a minute to take in her living room once she took my coat and put it in the closet in the hallway. The walls were covered with tapestries, and there were candles everywhere, with all kinds of odd trinkets and crystals and stuff like that. The room was dark, but not creepy, just really new agey. She noticed me looking at all the things in the room and bluntly said,
"I'm a Wiccan pup."
I smiled and told her I wasn't really sure what that was. Truthfully, I had a small idea, but she told me she'd tell me if I was interested. I was, and she asked if I wanted a drink. She was having wine. I said whatever she was having, and we sat down amongst all this witchcrafty stuff, and she started to tell me about herself. Grew up very Baptist. had been abused by her father, and basically her mother and the rest of the church blamed her for luring him away from God. She ran away from home at 18 after years of embarrassment and hurt.
That's when I found Wicca,
she said.
I was living from friend's place to friend's place until one friend's aunt said I could move in with her. I promised her I would get a job and help her pay for things too.
Well, that's where she learned about the lifestyle. Meditation, spells, ceremonies, all that stuff. Soon, she said she was so immersed in it, it became a way of life. When she couldn't get a job right away as she promised, the woman taught her some spells, and, pardon the pun, presto, a secretary job opened up, and she was hired.
It started to get so that all my spare time was filled by magic,
said Karen.
I was teaching myself to make my own clothes and jewelry, learning new ceremonies and rites, testing out spells. It was very liberating.
She got up and went to the kitchen, which opened onto the living room. She pulled out a loaf of bread from the oven and checked a pot on the stove. It smelled awesome.
Almost ready,
she said, and sat back down. She looked at me as I was playing with a crystal ball.
You think I'm crazy, don't you?
I smiled and said, not at all. I grew up having stuff crammed down my throat, so I think when anybody does what they want, I'm all for it. She smiled back. She told me that she moved out of the woman's place after she got some money together and bought the building we were sitting in now. I thought to myself, a cocktail waitress could buy an entire building? And she noticed my look. And why had I never known this? I didn't sign a lease agreement with her, just some guys in an office downtown.
I have my own business, Bob,
she said.
A lot of the stuff you see in this room I made. I sell it online to people, and also to some larger dealers. I make very good money.
I told her that I didn't mean to offend her, and she shook her head.
The bar thing is just fun for me. I keep to myself, but there I could talk to people and then just leave.
She said dinner was ready. We sat down at a table and she served the soup. It was sweet potato with spices, and I could smell truffles, too. Setting down some bread, she was shaving truffles onto the soup, and I was like, Jesus, she can afford truffles? The soup was amazing. She asked about me and what I did, and it was just a really cool time. We hung out for most of the evening, and it was just really fun. When I left, I thanked her, and she smiled. Later that night, I was falling asleep, and I thought I heard something coming from downstairs. It was a kind of chanting, but then there were some other noises, a gurgling and moaning. I figured Karen was watching a Wiccan movie or maybe doing one of her ceremonies. I just went to sleep. A couple of days later, I bumped into her again outside, and she looked different. She looked haggard, and I asked if she was feeling okay. She said she was fine, but just tired, and she went inside quickly. I shrugged and went inside too. Later that night, there was a knock at my door. I answered it, and it was Karen. She was crying, and I asked her to come in.
I'm sorry, I know it's late, but I need to talk to you.
No worries, I said. I got us both some tea, and she sat down on my couch.
Someone sent something after me, Bob,
she said bluntly. I raised my eyebrows and said, What?
The woman I used to live with, she sent something after me. I know it.
I'm confused. I don't know what you mean, I said.
Look, I didn't leave her place on the best of terms. She said one day my attitude would be my downfall. She was angry that I wasn't sharing any of my success with her.
Okay, I said.
Sometime last year, things started to happen. I couldn't keep any friends. My job at the office ended. My sleep is interrupted. And now, I know it's because of her. Anytime I find any success or happiness, this happens.
What can you do about it? Can't you tell her to stop it?
It doesn't matter. Once something is sent out, it can't be called back by the person who sent it. Does that make any sense?
Listen, I said. I heard something the other night. What was that all about? She lowered her head and said,
I was trying to push it back, reverse it into the one who sent it, but it didn't work. These awful noises come up from the basement, and it just didn't work.
Yeah, I heard, I said. So what now?
I think you can help me. Things started up when you moved in,
she said. I told her I didn't understand.
I like you, Bob. This thing comes and goes through my ups and downs. Whomever sent this doesn't want you in my life.
We were silent for a few minutes. Nice girl, kind of on the weird side, just tells me she likes me, has something chasing her around, needs my help. WTF. What does this entail? I asked.
I need to reverse it with some spells. You can help, because I think your presence will make a difference.
Not totally believing things and even considering I was being had for a joke, I said, okay. At least the night might be amusing. She got up silently and walked toward the door, and I smiled and followed. We went down to her place, and she started getting all this stuff together. I know this altar off to the side I didn't notice before, and she starts lighting candles and pushes the furniture out of the way and pours salt or something around in a big circle and drapes a blanket over it and then does it again. Karen lit more candles around the blanket and placed pieces of something black next to all the candles. I asked what I was supposed to do, and she asked me to light this incense stuff and another thing of what looks like sticks and leaves, and I had to wave it around the room. I was feeling pretty stupid about all of it when I heard some thumping coming from the basement. I looked down on the floor, and sure enough, something was pounding on the floor beneath me. I started to think that this is pretty freaky, but I'm still going with it. Karen sits on the blanket in the circle and starts to say these words that I can't make out. She motions me to keep walking around the circle, waving the stick thing in the air. After about 2 minutes of her speaking, the pounding came up, and this time I can hear a gurgling noise like I heard before. For a minute, I'm thinking this whole thing is a big joke, and any minute her friends are going to pop through the basement door and start laughing. But it doesn't happen, and the combination of the incense and smoke stick thing is getting to me, and it's making me lightheaded. Karen motions me to sit down next to her, facing her, as she keeps speaking the funny words. I'm fighting off the urge to not pass out at this point, and I'm starting to realize this is not a prank. Something strange is happening. She gets up and walks behind me, and the last coherent thought I had was turning around like a little kid, just spinning around to see what she was doing.
I need your help, Bob,
she whispered.
It's now or never, Bob.
The pounding is now even louder, and for a second I wonder if anyone outside can hear all of this. She walks towards the basement door down the hallway, and I notice that it's a hell of a lot darker down there than the rest of the apartment. Karen walked into the darkness and came back out, completely naked, walking towards me.
Help me now, Bob. Help me reverse this,
she whispered.
Help me.
She stands in front of me, and I'm so lightheaded and in shock that I don't do anything. I just stare. She put this piece of black stone on my forehead, and the next thing is just a blur. The pounding got louder. The moaning and gurgling is splitting my head. It's like there are all these black shapes floating around the room. My head was spinning. I was now on my back, and somehow I got naked, but I don't remember taking off my clothes. Karen got on top of me, and we started having sex. The moaning was now screaming, and Karen takes one of my hands and scrapes down it with this stone, and does so with my other hand. This is literally the most intense thing I've ever experienced, and I can't even explain it.
Help me, Bob,
she says. She picks up my hands that I see are now bleeding, and she puts them on her waist.
Help me now.
And that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in my bed and looked at the clock. It was 11:30 in the morning. My head hurt, and it took a minute for me to realize where I was. And then it came back. What the hell had happened last night? Did I get really high and imagine all that crazy stuff? The sounds, the smells, the sex with Karen? Was it just a dream? I slowly sat up on the side of my bed and pushed up with my hands. My hands left red marks on my sheets, and I held them up. There was blood on them, and I ran to the bathroom to wash them off. The blood came off, but there were no cuts or scrapes or anything. I shook my head and stood in disbelief. What the hell had happened? I wanted answers from Karen, so I ran back to my room, grabbed a pair of jeans I was wearing the night before, and they stunk of that incense and stick thing. I went out into the living room, pulling on a sweatshirt, and saw a note on the floor. I picked it up, and written inside was, "Thank you, Bob. Thank you for your help. Love, Karen." I held it in my hand and ran downstairs to her place. I got up to the front door and knocked a few times before seeing the "For Rent" sign in the window. I tried to see in, but the curtains wouldn't let me. After going back upstairs, I called the leasing office asking for Karen, and the guy who I'd signed all the paperwork with for my rental said they'd never even see her. She did all of her business through an intermediary. It was all banks, and they handled the day-to-day. Later that day, I went to the bar she worked at, and the bartender said she had called and quit, and that was that. I never saw or heard from Karen again. I tried to research all the stuff that had happened and even asked some people in a local group if they could help me, but no one could. The front unit stayed vacant until my lease was up, and I moved out. I know most of you won't believe this, but I'm a fan of Uncle Josh's and I know his policy about creepypasta. If he reads this, I cannot stress how much this is true. It changed my life in tons of ways, and while I don't believe it was necessarily paranormal, it was scary as hell. Any thoughts from the listeners are welcome. Thanks for listening, gang. Check out my Patreon page to find out how you can get access to exclusive content and keep this channel up and running for as little as $1 a month. And please follow me on social media. The links to such are in the description below. If you have a story you would like to hear in a future episode, send it over to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. And be sure to check out my live paranormal radio show, The Edge of the Unknown, each Sunday night from 8 to 10 Eastern on theedgeoftheunknown.com. Until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.